Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all the great energy in the room. I can't imagine, do people think we have anything to talk about tonight? So Steve and I would like to welcome Preet Bharara, who is the former
Yeah.
U.S. Attorney General
You're all safe.
of the Southern District of New York. And he's the distinguished scholar in residence at NYU Law and the host of the Cafe podcast, Stay Tuned, which I highly recommend everyone should tune into. So we are very excited to welcome Preet to our first live recording of a podcast. Steve and I just launched Words Matter about a month ago, and we're excited to have our first live podcast here at the 92nd Street Y.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for joining us.
It's good to be. Congratulations.
Oh,
Just proves that now everyone has a podcast.
Absolutely.
Not all of them are as excellent as yours, but everyone has one.
So to start out,
Okay.
let's start with Donald Trump liked to call you on your cell phone.
Right. Everything has
And
to start
how
with
this
Donald
came
Trump.
about. Let's start with the president-elect, the transition. He asked you to come and meet with him.
He did. So some people know the story, but so I expected not to be in office after Donald Trump won, because the tradition is that when a new president comes in, particularly one of the opposing party, that all sort of presidentially appointed, Senate confirmed people in the cabinet and also at the level of U.S. Attorney, they leave, through an orderly process over a period of time. So I began making expensive vacation plans because I thought I'd be going to the private sector, and made my bucket list. And then I got a phone call from Senator Schumer, for whom I used to work, that the president-elect had called him and said, "Do you think Preet would want to stay?" I thought about it, and I realized it's the best job I've ever had. We had some unfinished business. And so then I was asked to meet with the president-elect on the 26th floor of Trump Tower, and I went, and he was late, but to entertain me until the president-elect came into the room were Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner.
Were there any card tricks or any special talents?
But I did observe, I realized later that it was interesting that Steve Bannon was wearing only one shirt, which is not the norm. And we made small talk, and the president-elect complimented my office. I don't know if he'd make the same compliments today, for various reasons, and complimented me on how I'd run the office. And I said something like, I presume that you were asking me to stay for another term because you like the way that we run the office and we're independent and we don't care about politics. And I made sure I put that on the record, such as it was. And it was a very uneventful meeting, other than the moment where he pushed sort of a yellow pad of Post-its across the desk and asked me for my phone numbers, which I thought was odd for a couple of reasons. One, I presume someone had my phone number, because that's how I got there.
And you're married.
And I'm like, the president-elect is asking me for my digits, and no one seemed to think that was an odd thing. And so I wrote, "Call me anytime." I didn't say that for reason. So I put my numbers down. I didn't think anything of it. And then he called me a couple of times, which was weird, and get your antenna up when he was
shoot the breeze.
Ostensibly just to shoot the breeze. I mean, I have a theory on what was going on, and having seen the evidence of how he dealt with other people and how he dealt with Jim Comey. I mean, I think he was trying to cultivate a relationship with someone with whom it's kind of inappropriate to cultivate a relationship with. He didn't ask me to do anything that I shouldn't have done. But I was concerned about it. I reported that contact to the head of the transition for the president. And I thought to myself, well, when he becomes the president, he will be busy and he won't be calling me up on the cell phone, as they say. And that was on March 9th, a few weeks after he was sworn in as the president with all his duties. I get a call and I wasn't there. And so he left, the secretary left a message, President Trump would like to call you back. And the funny thing about this is, people say about the president, and the relevance to this, we don't have to belabor my little story, that he doesn't understand what the protocols are, he doesn't understand what interference is because he's never been in this kind of work. My father is a retired pediatrician Indian immigrant. And he, right away, when he heard that the president-elect had been calling me, my father hasn't read the guidance and the guidelines from the Justice Department either. And he's like, "I don't like this." So, and he literally said, like, I hope he does not call you And then the man calls, and you know what? At that point, we had a conversation. I actually said on the podcast, which you'll hear if you listen tomorrow when it comes out, this whole business about Rod Rosenstein joking, depending on which report you believe, about wiring up against the president. I mean, maybe it's a joke. He's a sarcastic guy. I know him. And people who are prosecutors make jokes about wiring people up. That's like how we get our thrills, making jokes like that. I basically had like a wiretap joke, and I had a subpoena joke. Those are my two jokes. And I left the dad jokes at home. But there's an element of truth even in jokes, right? So when the president left a message, and I thought, well, it's rude not to call back, but it might be inappropriate to call back, and what if he says something that he's not supposed to say? We had a discussion, and it was not a joke. Should I record the phone call with the president? And we said to ourselves, well, that's kind of weird. that seems a bridge too far. I didn't want to have been a person who recorded the president, and the best approach we thought was not to return the call at all. And I got the agreement and the acquiescence in that decision from, actually, which people don't realize, from the chief of staff to Attorney General Sessions, who said, yeah, we don't know why he's calling. The department is different from other places. It's not the Department of Agriculture or someone in the White House where you call someone up and you want to get a report on something. As we now know, and the reason I feel better about my decision not to call him back, even if that may have meant that was part of the reason I was asked 22 hours later for my resignation, I've never been more proud of anything that I've ever done, because he may have said something inappropriate. He may have said, like he said to Jim Comey, could you lay off this person? Or as he said to other people, could you go after this other person? And that's not how it's supposed to be. The Department of Justice and the people in it are supposed to, when they're enforcing the law and enforcing the principle of equal justice before law, are not supposed to be taking directions on who to prosecute, who not to prosecute, based on the whims of an elected official. That's supposed to be done separately.
So when you were fired, this, of course, birthed some conspiracy theories, one of which being he fired you because you didn't call him back. Do you think that's why?
I don't know, because everyone was asked to leave the next day, and I'm prepared to believe, I've never made an accusation with respect to this. I'm prepared to believe that maybe it had been brewing for a while, and this put him over the edge and said, fire everybody. It's also true that President Hannity was on, oh, did I say that out loud? that co-president Hannity, I'm sorry, said on his show that Thursday night, so when he called me on March 9th, that was a Thursday, on Thursday evening, I believe Hannity said on television, this is when they started talking a lot more about the deep state, such as it is, and Hannity said, fire all the U.S. attorneys. And what I really imagine happened, whether it was nefarious or not, is that Steve Miller or somebody came to a conference table the next morning. It's all speculation. Let's get rid of all these people without a plan. It was not that different from sort of implementing all sorts of other things that they have done, like getting rid of all the ambassadors, or in a more serious manner, issue the travel ban. They never thought to contemplate whether or not it applies to people who are green card holders or not, people who are en route back to the United States or not. They come up with sort of a fiat kind of decision, and then they don't have any ability to implement it properly, whether you're talking about separations at the border also. Sometimes the policies are nefarious and bad and done in bad faith and with ill will, but also incompetently. And depending on your perspective, that's maybe a good thing, because it's harder for evil to be done if you're incompetent, but it also is hard to discern which is which.
What's the nature of this moment that we're in this country? Is the country in a crisis?
Yeah.
What is the crisis?
I'm not saying it as eloquently as I've heard you say it. Steve's also been a guest on the podcast. Look, if you start to break it down, you can convince yourself that any particular thing is sort of not so bad, right? So what I say when I want to be optimistic and give people hope, but not too much hope, is that if you look at the institutions of democracy, a lot of them are holding up pretty well. So for example, the press. So what you have is the disparagement of the press. You have a president saying the press is the enemy of the people. That's terrible, and he calls out particular people by name, and there's a suggestion that violence against members of the press are all right, and there's a subversion of what is true and what is not true. So people, like you might expect in the prior Soviet Union, and to some extent in Russia, you just sort of destroy what truth is, and you make people uncertain about what they can trust and what they can't trust. All that's bad. But when the president says things about changing the libel laws, he can't do that. It's not going to happen. When he says things about taking the licenses away from newspapers or from radio stations or TV stations, I really don't believe that we're not on the precipice of that. He can't do that. That's rhetoric. So, and on the other side of the token, based on the work that you and others do, the press is very vibrant and is doing scoop after scoop after scoop and is discovering a lot of things that prosecutors haven't been able to discover and ferreting out all sorts of corrupt. So the press it's attacked and it's under siege, and it's maybe more under siege by the economic model of being in the print world than other things, but I think it's okay. The courts, yeah, they're being attacked. He attacks people by name, but there's something to be said for the structure of the Constitution that these folks a few hundred years ago thought of, which is you get life tenure. And there's an argument to be made that life tenure is bad because people stay on the bench too long. But the fact that you have life tenure was intended to insulate the court and members of the bench and in the federal system from this kind of thing. So if you're a judge and you get on the wrong side, as I like to say, if you're a judge, you get on the wrong side of the President of the United States, he calls you out on Twitter. If you're a U.S. attorney who gets on the wrong side, then you get a podcast. So there's a because U.S. attorneys didn't have life tenure. And then Congress is a mixed bag depending on what's going on. Where I think the threat is, from my perspective, my parochial thing that I care about being in law enforcement is the independence of the law enforcement function. The independence of the FBI, the independence of the United States attorneys, the independence of people who pursue civil rights investigations and all sorts of other things, and a lack of faith and trust that those folks are doing their jobs in the way that we have been trained to do them. Because there's actually not a law unless you can, put together a strong enough case. It's very difficult to do, although some people think it's been made and want it to be made, of obstruction against a president. And all these things that we thought, to go back to your original question, Gary Kasparov, who also has been a guest on the show, I think in some ways put it best, and I think other people have said the same thing. A lot of what we expect and what happens on the part of a president and our elected leaders is done on the honor system. President has never been required to be transparent about his taxes and about his income. There are issues that the president is sort of above, and if an ordinary person in government did those things, they'd be fired. The president can tweet in a way that you didn't expect someone to be able to tweet. And so, to me, I think the concern is that you've got a president who's violating all these norms, and a question that needs to be asked is which of those things do we need to do something about going forward into the future to make into a hard law?
Is it actual corruption or is it violation of norms? Donald Trump's behavior with respect to, say, his family business holdings, the hotel. Donald Trump felt he had to weigh in on the FBI's renovation across the street from the Trump Hotel.
Yeah.
What crosses the line?
If you're asking the question of what is criminal, what is a thing that is a violation of federal criminal law that you would put under the umbrella of corruption, that's a high hurdle. I don't think anybody brought as many corruption cases going back a few generations than my office did when I was there. And Sheldon Silver is convicted twice, and Dean Skelos is convicted twice, and it used to be the case that it was, you had a greater likelihood of leaving the New York State legislature by indictment than by defeat at the polls, which I think is gradually changing. But you don't want to give the false impression that sometimes our success gave, that it's easy to do. It's really, really hard. The burden is really, really high, and you have to have really, really strong evidence. And I'm not aware of yet that someone has put together a case that is based on corruption. In other words, a quid pro quo, people taking bribes to engage in official action. The Supreme Court has also made it a little bit more difficult, which is why we had to try Sheldon Silver and Dean Skelos twice, by narrowing the definition after if you want continuing legal education credit, you'd probably get it today. But I think it's hard to do. I haven't seen it proven in a crystallized way that you would need in a court of law. But that's not to say that there's not corruption with a small c going on. Corruption of truth, corruption of process, corruption of institutions, corruption of democracy. I think, if separate and apart from using it as a legal term of art in a criminal court, I think that everything about how Donald Trump is engaged in his job and the way he's brought people into his close-knit circle is all about corruption. He associates with corrupt people. He associates with people who are not corrupt and corrupts them. Who's the person who has recently a book called Everything That Trump Touches Dies? So there's a motivation to corruption, a base level of corruption, a tolerance of corruption that permeates, I think, everything that this White House does.
We're looking at the Kavanaugh allegations such as they are and accumulating as we speak. And the question I had is, if there was a 15-year-old African-American kid who got caught and arrested smoking a joint, and then got it together, went to Yale, went to Harvard Law School, had a spotless public record, would he be disqualified from serving as a U.S. attorney or a Supreme Court justice because of that juvenile marijuana offense?
If you're asking like the straight up, I didn't know that's where you were going with the question. As a straight up technical question, I don't know I'm not sure. There has been sort of a change in the thinking about the use of marijuana, given legalization in various places, and the federal government is trying to decide exactly what it wants to do, and I think it would have been more liberal about it had a different person been elected. For a time, any admitted, known or admitted marijuana usage would have been completely, precludes you from serving in a lot of places. People maybe have been talking about it recently because we're talking about Supreme Court nominations, but there was a withdrawn nomination to the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan of a different Judge Ginsburg because he smoked marijuana, but I think that was in law school. I don't know that we went as far back as prior to adulthood, so I don't know if it would have been preclusive or not. But but the larger point is, are there double standards? Yeah, and I think some of what people are correctly talking about in the criminal justice system is, are there certain enclaves of white privilege where Princeton, Yale, other places, communities where people have a lot of money, where a kid's smoking a joint and they get a slap on the wrist, or the cop walks away if there's a drunken incident, but in other neighborhoods that are not so privileged, there's an arrest and there's a prosecution and you get a record. And even though it's technically the case that in both cases an infraction or a criminal violation was committed, they're not pursued equally. And I think that's a problem.
How do you grade this administration's efforts on criminal justice reform? Because we hear one thing from Jared Kushner at the White House, and then from Jeff Sessions at the Justice Department, it seems to be a completely different story.
Yeah. Jared Kushner is working on criminal justice reform in the Middle East, right? Is that?
I think China,
I thought that's what
Mexico, Canada?
Yeah, I don't know, and weights and measures. I think, not really. I think it's unfortunate. I think that there had been some progress made, and prosecutors are very conservative folks. I don't mean ideologically, but they don't, and lawyers generally, they don't go for change quickly, right? So when people start suggesting that people's discretion, if they work in law enforcement, should be exercised a little less aggressively, that takes some doing on the part of prosecutors. And I think we started to have, towards the end of the Obama administration, Eric Holder put out this memo, which is known inside the department as the very fancy name, clever, the Holder Memorandum. And it basically allowed prosecutors in my office and offices around the country, which I think is a form of criminal justice reform, to depending on the circumstances, not pursue a mandatory minimum charge, even if it was totally provable. So in other words, and I won't give you all the factors, but if you were a person who had not been convicted of a crime before, if you're not a leader or an organizer of the criminal gang, and you had not engaged in any violence, you hadn't carried a gun, that prosecutors in their discretion, knowing their districts and knowing what the possibilities of deterrence were, you didn't have to charge them, which is very different from what John Ashcroft had said you had to do, with a mandatory minimum. And that person could get something of a second chance because you weren't being as harsh as the law permits, even though Congress passed these laws, which I think are outmoded many years earlier. And you know what? People didn't love that in the department. And there's lots of progressive folks in the department, but you become prosecutors, you get used to doing something a certain way. And then after time, people thought, you know what? This is not causing crime to go up. It's a good way to exercise our discretion. And they got used to it. I think we were getting to a point where both liberals and conservatives, however we want to describe those labels and define them, were reaching a consensus that certain things we were doing too harshly and too aggressively. That's one example, mandatory minimums. Whether people should be incarcerated for as long as they have been, whether there should be money in programs to help people, which is an issue I care about a lot and cared about when I was in the job. The conditions of confinement. One of the proudest things that I feel that we tried to accomplish was fixing Rikers Island, which is broken and terrible and a real issue. And I think we were moving in a good direction. And so my concern is that when Jeff Sessions came in, And I think even a different Republican Attorney General, consistent with what some people like the Koch brothers think is important, criminal justice reform, we might have made more progress. But I feel we turned the clock back a little bit. So for example, not in every respect, but in many respects, that Holder memorandum that I described that would allow prosecutors greater discretion and not bring the full hammer down on every single person no matter what without taking account of the circumstances, that hammer now has to come down pretty much. And I think that's a step back. So the answer to your question is I don't feel great about it.
You know, we were talking backstage about the Judiciary Committee, which you were a staffer on for a couple Supreme Court confirmations.
The same ones that you worked on the other side.
And on the other side of it. Now, when watching this unfold between Grassley and Feinstein, Grassley's been up there for 38 years. Dianne Feinstein's been there for 26.
Yeah.
So they have been colleagues in a body of 100 people for 26 years.
Long time.
And put aside the allegations, put aside partisanship and ideology, just as a work product. Two people pushing 90 years old, working together for 26 years. This is the outcome?
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
Look, it's longer than a lot of marriages that end worse. So I actually asked this question. So I still have some friends and former colleagues who are on the committee, and I'll call them up like, "What's going on? What's going to happen?" They tell me, I'm not going to tell you. But I asked the question: Is what we're seeing? Because sometimes you don't know what you see. Because sometimes there's showmanship, right? And I worked for Senator Schumer on the Judiciary Committee for 4.5 years. And sometimes people go to the podium, and at the hearing, this, and they say a bunch of stuff, but then they're friends, and they get along, but they disagree about policy and whatever else. So I was trying to find out if they really seem as angry at each other, or are they doing things for their particular constituencies? And I was told, no, they're really angry at each other. So I think things have devolved, quite a bit, and I don't quite know why. Maybe the stakes are higher. Maybe, Trump makes everyone more agitated than they used to be and more angry than they used to be. I don't know if that's what you meant by your question.
What do you think about how the allegations were handled and processed by the Senate Judiciary?
Yeah, they're still coming. As we walked in, there was another allegation, and look, do you want to describe the allegation?
NBC News just broke an anonymous allegation, 1998. I believe it is the mother of a witness to an accusation of assault. I read it quickly on Twitter coming in, so I don't want to give any fake news, incorrect facts. I shouldn't have said that. We've all adopted
the vernacular of fake news. That's another problem.
But I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's
unfolded.
So the funny thing about having been a prosecutor and then watching people conduct what they call investigations or hearings or handle allegations, if prosecutors' offices handled allegations and inquiries for the truth the way that congressional committees do, we'd all be like living in a hellscape. It would be a real problem. But it's a different. Mostly, prosecutors do everything they can not to air allegations, right? So, if Dianne Feinstein had come into receipt of, some allegations, and she had been the U.S. attorney as opposed to a senator who has to operate in a political setting where there's going to be a future public airing of things, it would have been kept quiet, it would have been investigated, it would have been handled. The biggest problem I have, I think a lot of people have, with how the allegations have been handled, is that seemingly for partisan reasons and power reasons, right? You always want your guy to get confirmed, and I'm sure, on the other side, you want someone not to get confirmed. And so I think there's a little bit of blame everywhere where people are so intent on preventing an outcome or pursuing an outcome, and that is to put this person on the Supreme Court or to prevent this person from being on the Supreme Court. There are some people who are less concerned about figuring out the truthfulness of the allegations and the relevance of those allegations to the ability to serve than they are at finding the thing that is either going to cause the person not to be able to go forward or to just dismiss the thing out of hand, even if credible, so that the person is installed, right? There's a lot of that going on. And, what I hope and what I long for on all these things, whether it's allegations against Trump or last year or before the election against Hillary Clinton, is that people take a step back and think, if this was my family member or this was me, and it wasn't about politics, and it wasn't about a Supreme Court seat, but serious, credible allegations were made. You know, you have to think about how you would view it if you knew a participant, either the victim or the person accused, and you want a system that is fair to all those people, right? And it seems to me that it's odd and strange, separate apart from the politics of it, that there has not been an FBI investigation, especially since you had the precedent of Anita Hill. And by the way, people keep talking about the Anita Hill precedent, that the FBI did an investigation. That was 3 days. They talked to some people. So it was, you know, sort of cursory, but it was still something. And I think not only does it do a disservice to the truth, for people not to have allowed an FBI investigation to go forward with respect to these allegations, even though they were a long time ago, I think it does a disservice to, I believe, to Kavanaugh himself. Your colleague, I was just saying, you know, it appears on my podcast this week, Nicole Wallace, you know, she and I both agree, and I think a lot of people do, that it's bad for Kavanaugh. You know, sometimes it's the case that the right thing and the expedient thing, even for the person in the short term, who might think in the short term it's not good for them, is good for them, right? Because now you have someone who looks very much like they don't want an investigation because there's something to hide. You know, it's sort of like common sense that if you are innocent and none of these things are true, you kind of welcome it, you know, and they're not. And so I think, you know, with respect to that aspect of how the allegations have been handled, I think it's sort of inexcusable.
The precedent here that I think is most relevant isn't Anita Hill, it's John Tower in the confirmations for a defense secretary who, that late in the process, before the vote, there were allegations of excessive drinking. And what happened is the FBI reopened the background investigation, and in 2 days' time, they came back and said, he drinks a lot. And his nomination was withdrawn.
Right, but that drinking was in recent times as opposed to 35 years ago.
It was. But the issue, right, of course, is that you go to a White House and you're asked the question on your security clearance form that, have you smoked marijuana? And you write down yes. I wrote down yes. You would not write down yes.
Oh, I wrote down yes.
You know what's so funny? But
when you're asked about it by the FBI agents, they're not looking to disqualify you for smoking marijuana. They're looking to see if you lie about smoking marijuana on the eve of going to work in a senior position in the White House. And that, to me, is the issue that's going to be laid bare here. Is he lying now about behavior back then that he's probably right to be embarrassed by? And I think that that is what we're going to see play out a bit tomorrow.
Yeah, look, you know, you'd be surprised to learn that the people who apply to be assistant U.S. attorneys in my office, you get an FBI background check, and it's pretty full vetting, and you have to say all these things that you may have done. And the questions are not just about obvious things like, have you smoked marijuana or other illicit substances, but also, have you ever had a credit card problem? Have you ever had, you know, a certain kind of other infraction? And the things that people will admit, that I'm like, we don't really care about that. But to me, it's very heartening because these young idealistic lawyers don't want to be put in this position that you're describing. They tell you everything, you know, from the time that they urinated on the beach to like I had an overdraft on my Discover card when I was a sophomore in college. But that gives you some comfort, right, that they are telling you the truth and they're honorable and honest people. And I'm not necessarily saying this applies to Brett Kavanaugh because I'm not an armchair psychologist, but you know, there are people in the world, in politics and in law, who want something so badly, right, they do themselves a disservice by trying to present themselves as perfect when nobody is, right? And I think one criticism, thinking about it from the comms perspective, which I try not to do, but it's much in the news this week, is I don't think, you know, John McCain, right, who you have a close former association with, never said that he was top of his class before he entered the service, right? There's a feeling in the ether now that Brett Kavanaugh, who I've met a couple of times and we have mutual friends, and I've never known him to be anything other than a nice, you know, composed, respectful guy. But there's a feeling in the ether that he tried to present himself as like the perfect Boy Scout going back to the beginning of time when it wasn't necessary to do that. And that people should concede things from time to time. He had a boisterous, maybe he committed these things, and that's terrible, and those are criminal acts. But at a minimum, right, it's readily known and provable from dozens and dozens of people that he had a certain kind of lifestyle in high school and college. Maybe that's fine, maybe that's not. But it's, and I think part of the reason that people are vacating him and are having questions about his credibility and other specific matters is because he a little bit looks like that guy who's like wants to be the front of the line, and has, since the test tube, has wanted to be on the Supreme Court, and has done and we all know people like this, and has done everything possible, which is fine, has done everything possible to clear the path to the Supreme Court. And there seems to be a little bit of lack of truth in the presentation of himself, that's all.
I think that's a brilliant observation.
Thank you, Steve.
So with the Russia investigation.
Oh, right.
Oh, that Russia investigation.
It took us 36 minutes to get to the Russia investigation.
Hey,
That's how much news there is.
Exactly, you can't. I mean, it's just too much. You have a relationship with Robert Mueller. What should we expect from him?
He's my father. I wanted to break some news here now. He's not as pure as, yeah, so I did not have a close relationship with him, but I was the U.S. attorney when he was the FBI director for a period of time, and we worked on cases together, and I met him a number of times. I know a lot of people who work for him much more directly, and to a person, they all revere him. What was your question about him?
What should we expect?
Oh, look, so I think you could expect what you've seen so far. A couple of things. One is, you're not going to see him speak and talk, right? Even with respect to some of the public indictments that have made, I think he could have been well within his rights to have announced those cases. Instead, Rod Rosenstein did, because I think he just wants to keep his head down. The second thing is, I say to people, and they don't believe me, these documents that get filed and that grand juries sign off on, the indictments and the plea agreements and others, they're really fascinating documents, and they're good reads. And the reason I say that is, there's very little criticism of the substance of what is in these documents. Typically, when someone gets charged, or the 12 or 13 GRU agency officials from Russia got charged with all sorts of bad things, the thing that people who don't like Mueller, what they say is, well, it doesn't talk about the president. It's not about the president. They don't say it's shoddy work. They don't say, well, it's kind of made up. They actually don't say that's even fake news, because the meticulousness of those documents speaks for itself. And so, with respect to the GRU case, I mean, literally, it's minute by minute when a particular named, specified human being who's Russian, with aliases if available, when they went into particular desktops in particular places to the minute.
It's a fascinating indictment. Everyone should read it.
But the value of that, and to answer your question, the reason why I think that's important going forward is the thing speaks for itself. And I don't think Mueller is allowing his team to engage in speculation or pushing the envelope too much. They have it, and they have a fact, or they have an allegation, or they have a charge dead to rights. They do it up. They don't dress it up. They do it up incredibly rigorously and vigorously, and it speaks for itself. So the thing that people are looking for in the future with respect to a potential report on the full Russia investigation, I expect that to be a document, if we ever see it, which I believe we would, is again going to be a tour de force of concrete, specific, detailed, uneditorialized, fact after fact after fact, that's going to be very difficult to rebut. And so if they don't have it, I don't think he's going to engage in stretches, right, and make leaps between this fact and then infer something else. It's going to read something like things that people don't read so often, but are, for me, good reads. Inspector General reports. A good Inspector General, who's not necessarily prosecuting a case, takes a look at what happened and says, these are the things we did, here are the people we interviewed, here are the documents we got, here are the documents we didn't get, here are the documents that were destroyed, and here are the best conclusions we can come up with, chapter and verse. And so whatever product we're going to see, and maybe it's not going to be the thing that a lot of people who hope is going to be the death knell to the president or the presidency, maybe it won't have that. But whatever you see, I believe is going to be rock solid, because that's how Bob Mueller operates.
Why do people revere him? Talk to us about the man a little bit.
So he's decent, he's honorable, he's honest, he works as hard as anyone you've ever seen in your life, he leads by example, he cares about folks, he served with distinction. I mean, the thing, I was asked to write the short blurb on Bob Mueller for Time magazine when they put him on their list of the 100 most influential people in the world. And I started the piece by saying, you know, Robert Mueller III is a man who doesn't take deferments, right? And what I meant by that is he's a person who had a privileged life. He went to Princeton. He was a lacrosse player. He graduated from Princeton in the late 60s, and one of his Princeton classmates died in the Vietnam War. And you know what? Less honorable people, less courageous people, less brave people might say, well, glad I didn't go there. Good thing I had these bone spurs. He, on the other hand, oh, you get the reference. The 92nd Street Y is very, very, very knowledgeable. We get a good crowd here. He and other colleagues who graduated from Princeton said, we're gonna serve, because that's what you do. So he always goes into battle. He had, you know, I'll give you another example of his dedication to service above ego, because there are a lot of people who are great public servants and do great things, and they also have egos, and that's okay because it can fuel ambition. But Robert Mueller had, I think, 2 really high, big deal jobs, Senate confirmed jobs. And I'm forgetting the order a little bit. I think he had been the Assistant Attorney General for the criminal division. He also been the U.S. Attorney in Boston and in San Francisco. And then he goes to private practice, and he's like, well, this kind of sucks, because it's not public service of the kind that he had always been drawn to, whether in the military or in civilian life. And he decides, you know, there's a high crime problem in Washington, D.C. at the time, and he called, and I think it was Eric Holder was the U.S. Attorney in D.C. at the time. He's like, you know, can I come back, even though he'd been so high ranking, and I'll just be a guy in the line, just like try homicide cases. And he went back to the Justice Department, to a local U.S. Attorney's office, and he tried homicide cases, because that's what you do. I think that speaks volumes about him.
You.
I've been really interested to watch Mike Flynn as this process evolves. And recently, his sentencing date, I think, is now set for the end of December.
Yeah.
What's at stake for Mike Flynn?
So that's a good question. You know, I don't know. There were all these theories about what his plea deal signified, and some people, I think, speculated because he didn't plead guilty to that much, right? False statements, which don't carry the biggest penalty in the world. And some people thought that must mean he has a lot of information he gave up. He's going to be testifying in a number of cases going forward against people we don't yet know who will be indicted, including issues relating to Russia, perhaps Turkey, and some other things. I wasn't so sure about that. I feel less sure about that now, because if they've agreed, and what it means when someone who's a cooperating person with the government, when the government agrees to let that person be sentenced, almost always, although I caution always because this is a special kind of case that we've never seen before, but almost always, that means that person's usefulness is over. It also likely means that there's no further need to have that person testify. Now, the idea that he is cooperating in a particular way to bring about the charging and arrest of some other person at whose trial he might have to testify seems hugely unlikely, given that they're acceding to his being sentenced in December. So for him, I don't know exactly what it means. For the Mueller investigation, to me, it suggests, don't know for sure, but it suggests that he is not going to be the proximate cause of other big deal prosecutions in connection with the special counsel's case.
What did you make of the op-ed in the New York Times, which feels like it occurred 9.5 years ago, by the anonymous administration official?
Who wrote that? Do you know?
Who wrote it? I thought you knew.
I think Siri.
I have to say, not to digress, I was struck by your startling lack of compassion for bone spurs, a serious medical condition.
It depends on who has them. And how real they are. It's about the truth, Steve. Look, so yeah, I don't love that anonymous person, right? I don't love the idea that this person, in a semi-self-aggrandizing way, and from the remove of anonymity, is saying all these things. I understand the point. I guess it might make a difference if I knew how high up the person was, and I might have a different view, but probably not. Because I'm losing patience with the proposition that these not anonymous people, these people we know, based on reporting, are very concerned about the president and think that they need to stay in their jobs to protect the country from the president. You know, at first that seems kind of noble. Well, thank God they're there. But I'm growing very tired of them, because there are other ways also in the longer term to cause something better to happen. And for example, it would be nice if there are 3 such people, and if Mattis is one of them, great, and if, you know, Kelly is one of them, great. You actually speak your mind, and you resign noisily, and you tell the public what's at stake. And maybe that has the, maybe not, but maybe it has the effect of curbing the president. Maybe it has the effect of letting other people do the same thing. And I think if you had a procession of people who cared about the country, who care about transparency, who care about their own reputations in a particular way, right? Their reputations for doing the right thing, and not this sort of quiet, secret, you know, conceited martyrdom, which I worry about a little bit. And there was a train of people who leave the White House and say, the country is at risk, we have a problem, he's not fit, he has the attention span of a 5th grader, and all the other things that people say. That might actually have some effect. And I'd prefer to see that than the occasional anonymous op-ed in the New York Times.
From a law enforcement perspective, thinking about the southern border, I'm struck by the fact that there appears to be nobody in federal law enforcement who, when they are ordered to separate a 6-month-old baby that is breastfeeding from its mom, says, "You want me to do what?"
Yeah.
Go F yourself.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that.
That's a great point.
Resignations. It seems to me it's in a legal order. It's in a moral order. Why isn't law enforcement and those agencies, anybody in them, responding in that way?
That's a great question. I don't know, and I think they should. My shortest answer of the evening.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's take a few audience questions.
Absolutely.
The one started for you, Steve. The question is, who is in the White House to speak truth to power?
There's nobody. Look, I think that people fall into 3 broad categories on this. I do think there are a couple of people that are necessary to defend the country and to protect, for example, the armed forces from Trump, and that would be Jim Mattis. And I think there would be global panic if you saw him step down. Now, most of the people in there are accomplices. They're helping him because they like what he's doing. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is into it, right? Now, most of the people, right, probably fall into a category where they are careerists. And these are the people that I have a particular contempt for, and I think it is shared by Preet. And their proposition will someday be, well, Donald who? No. I was there fighting him all the way. So their virtue in their mind is this: well, I like my title, I like my motorcade, I like my security detail, I like flying around on Air Force One. I don't really like him that much personally, but I like the power of my job. And that, I think, is contemptible. And, you know, it is those people that, you know, one day will all be out with a revisionist history of this period of time. And I think that they should be held to account.
Another question, and I think this is for everyone. When the Trump saga finally comes to an end, do you think we can ever get back to the middle? Do you think it's possible to bridge the divide and get back to civility?
I hope so. Look, I think, yes, I think the question is, how long will it take? And if you believe, and you know more about politics than I do, Steve, if you believe that presidential elections are often referendums on the thing that just happened, right? And so Donald Trump was a reaction in part to Obama, and you look for something that's sort of different and change. It's always change, but change from the thing you just had. That the next time we're in a go-around on this, we'd elect someone who has, you know, the opposite qualities in many ways that Donald Trump has. But I think it's going to take a long period of healing and making up.
You know, I think about this question from the perspective of what will they write 50 years from now about this moment in time and what comes after it. And I have a point of view that there is nothing wrong in America that cannot be fixed by what's right in the country. But I think the choice ahead for us as a country is renewal or decline. And we should make no mistake about it that the country is on a path of decline in many, many ways. And
not economic decline, is it?
42% of the country doesn't have $400 of cash available for emergency. I mean, there are more payday lenders in this country than there are Starbucks, and there are almost more payday lenders than there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined, and there are a shit ton of Starbucks and McDonald's in America. So I think that there's a crisis in capitalism. I think historically, if you understand FDR's presidency, I would have a point of view that he saved free market American capitalism from its excesses and prevented the rise of a totalitarian movement or an authoritarian movement in that moment in history. The economic dislocation, I think, is profoundly important in terms of understanding our political instability, but the regression of democracy all over the world is a real thing. And I think that the next presidential election is as likely to be the most significant in the country since the election of 1864, which really decided whether we were going to continue to be a country or not.
So how long is it going to take?
I think like what has always been true almost providentially in the country is that it has produced the right leaders in the right moments, unexpectedly. Harry Truman, a failed haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, a plain-spoken man who you wouldn't have high expectations of coming out of a very corrupt Democratic machine, the Pendergrass machine in Kansas City. Ulysses Grant was selling firewood on a street corner in 1859, down and out on his luck. Dwight Eisenhower was a colonel in the Army who hadn't been promoted in 13 years in 1940. And so the moment of crisis in the country historically in 1856, on the edge of the Civil War, we had one of the worst presidents, and probably, if Trump is the worst president in American history, and I believe he is, the second worst is probably Buchanan in 1856. But it took a Buchanan for us to get a Lincoln. And the question is, and I always think about Lincoln in this story, is William Tecumseh Sherman was highly skeptical of Lincoln when he was elected, and he said, the country's doomed. We've elected a backwoods barbarian. He's uneducated. He has no prospects to deal with the crisis in front of us. And then he was asked to comment about Lincoln after his death. And he had seen him with Grant a week before, and he said, I've met all the great men of the world. I've met the kings and the emperors and the queens and the industrialists, but I never met a man who possessed more of the qualities of greatness and goodness than Abraham Lincoln. And so I believe, right, that the presidency amplifies character, right? Donald Trump is who Donald Trump is, and all of his flaws and all of his character are magnified by his office. But I do believe that there are leaders out there who possess those qualities of greatness and goodness and who have it in their heart, the concept that you can't love your country if you hate half the people in it, and that the mission of the next president is to bring about a season of reconciliation, because at the end of the day, we're in it together. And you can't succeed as a country when everybody's fighting each other with the anger that we see today. So I'm hopeful, but also alarmed.
Well, this is a good segue to the next question for you. Steve, are you going to help Democrats' campaigns in 2020 to get Republicans out of office?
I guess I was the headliner for my first ever fundraising event for a Democratic congressional candidate on the Upper East Side. And
times are a-changing.
The times, they are a-changing. But yeah, listen, this is the most important midterm election in American history, period, full stop. Trumpism must be repudiated. And if it is not, if it is validated in this election, if there is not a check put on this guy, we're going to be down the road to living in a different country than the one we grew up in. It is essential that there be a check. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to get better politics out of it. I mean, we have a debate in this country that the choice devolves to dumb and dumber. And think about immigration. Our politics has presented a choice where, on the one hand, we can seize little babies from their parents at the border and put them into internment camps. And on the other hand, we can have no immigration enforcement at all. And I'm thinking that between the two, maybe somewhere in the middle, right, we can find some agreement. And so our politics on issue after issue, where 80% of the American people just basically conceptually agree, because Americans are endowed mostly, most of us, I think, with some level of common sense. We have the political parties are pushing any commonsensical solution out of bounds, and it's a tragedy because we have some problems we need to fix in the country.
So speaking of 2020, are you going to run for the Democratic nomination?
Yeah. Well, you'd have to repeal part of the Constitution. I was born in India. Mostly, I'm just trying not to get deported at this point. I'm like, if I can stay in the country, I'm good. I'm in good shape. Who is going to be the person? Can we? Who's this Abraham Lincoln savior figure that you're describing?
As of now, it seems like it's shaping up to be 2016 for the Democrats and a food fight of 20 candidates fighting for resources, dividing the party. As of now, it's too early, but I would just say that there is no savior figure who has become apparent, except though perhaps there's a certain senator candidate in Texas who has quite a spark. And I know you have some thoughts on that too. Ted Cruz. No,
I think you gotta think about this like sports, right? That there's brackets, and there's different like NFC East, West, and South, right? And so you have the senator bracket, and you have Bernie Sanders, Kristen Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren. I'm missing someone in there, and so I have a very senior Democrat in the state of California who supported a single-payer proposal out there that costs $450 billion a year. And the state budget all in the state of California is $145 billion a year. And so what I said to him is, explain to me like I'm a third grader why that lie is different than Trump saying we're going to build a wall that Mexico's going to pay for it. And I said, as a matter of political strategy, if you post up dishonest progressivism against Trumpism, it's not possible to win a dishonesty contest with Donald Trump. He wins every time. So we have that bracket, and that bracket is pulling to the left. We have a break glass bracket in the middle that's forming. That's Biden, it's Bloomberg, it's John Kerry, it's 78 years old, it's you know us.
Steve's been kind of ageist tonight.
You know us. We're not gonna start World War III. You put us in there, it's an emergency. And then you have a new bracket, which is, I think, Eric Garcetti, Mitch Landrieu, possibly the governor of Montana, Bullock, John Hickenlooper from Colorado, maybe the governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee, but it's going to be more west. It's going to be young. You have two candidates, Seth Moulton, 40 years old, congressman from Massachusetts, Marine Corps officer who did 5 combat tours, Tim Ryan from Youngstown, Ohio, the nemesis in the House conference of Nancy Pelosi, someone who's pushing generational change. So it's going to be an enormous field.
What about outside of politics?
And Michael Avenatti will be a candidate. And I'll say
Look,
this.
I don't laugh anymore. I don't laugh anymore.
I'm not laughing.
I'll say this about Michael Avenatti is you get close to the New Hampshire primary, and as Democratic voters are looking, it's a lot like American Idol. It's going to basically be like this. We gonna keep that guy around for another week? Yeah, we're gonna keep that guy around for another week. All right? And so we're gonna see a field that's as big as the Republican field was in 2016. They're not all gonna fit on the debate stage, and I think it's as open as any race could conceivably be.
Well, I think this might be a good final question.
What is your favorite Bruce Springsteen album, Preet, and why?
You know, so I like them all.
Now that's a political answer.
Yeah, but my favorite song is Thunder Road, which is not, you know, it sort of seems passé to talk about a popular album that everyone knows. You're supposed to, if you're a Springsteen fan or you're, you know, an Elvis Costello fan or whatever group you're a fan of, you're supposed to pick something obscure to show like how much you know. I like that stuff, but you know, the old stuff Born to Run. But I'll say just for purposes of this question, I think an underrated album, maybe it's not that underrated, is The Rising, which, you know, I'll never forget being at a concert in New Jersey, in the Meadowlands in 2000. I think the album came out in 2002, or the middle or end of 2002, because it was right after 9/11. And there were all these people in the audience who were there for the classics and the songs that they knew, and they hadn't really listened to the new album. And I had listened to it a lot because it was very evocative of things that happened on 9/11, which were still very raw and fresh. And I saw these young guys who talked all the way through the songs from The Rising, including Into the Fire and songs like that are about, you know, difficult things. And I was disappointed in them and wondered why that. It's sort of like when you go see bands play and they have their new album, they got to play a lot of songs from the new album. The new album's not very good. But then you fast forward a few years, and some of the songs from The Rising are sort of Springsteen anthems that people have come to love and appreciate and like, but they didn't in 2002. And so I think the strength of that album over time has been extraordinary.
When you said all of them, it reminded me of Donald Trump's single greatest answer on the question of what was his favorite Bible verse. And of course, he replied, all of them. I love all of them.
I thought his single greatest answer, actually maybe I shouldn't mention this, was, and it was like to the point, and it's gross to think about, but with respect to this rumored thing that exists somewhere, the President of the United States of America said, I'm a germaphobe. Okay, your turn, Steve.
And with that, we will all sleep soundly tonight.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming out.
Thank
That
you.
was fun.